Hello, everyone. I'm Monica Luciana. I'm professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, and I co-lead with Jim Bjork the ABCD work group on neurocognition. So today I'm really delighted to share with you some information about the neurocognitive assessment battery and provide you, hopefully, with some guidelines that will be useful as you work with the neurocognition data. I have a few objectives that I'd like to just share in advance for things that I'm hoping to cover today. So first, I'm going to share with you the goals of the ABCD neurocognition battery. These were reviewed in detail at the last ReproNim course, and so my overview of those will be relatively brief. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the types of measures that we have used in the battery, but then focus most of the time on the longitudinal assessment scheme and protocol changes that have taken place since 2020. Finally, I'll leave you with some ideas about methodological considerations to hold in mind as you are working with the longitudinal neurocognitive data. So beginning then with goals of the neurocognition battery, um, so overall, a major goal of the project has been to facilitate the examination of typical developmental changes in cognition through the adolescent period and into young adulthood. So to achieve this goal, we have focused on administering measures of reasoning skills, both crystallized and fluid reasoning, executive functions, which of course many people are interested in the course of the adolescent period, verbal learning and memory, and also how youth make decisions under conditions of risk and how they control their emotions in settings where motivations might be running high and potentially interfering with cognitive performance. We also hope to capture altered cognitive trajectories that are due to experiences that the youth uh, engage in, and including things like substance use, mental health symptoms, and other kinds of emergent and environmental factors. And then a primary goal is for us to be able to dissociate predictors of maybe altered trajectories from consequences of these factors. So if we take substance use as an example, we'd like to know what kinds of cognitive profiles might predict that youth are going to initiate substances at an earlier versus later age, but then alternatively, what levels of cognition or domains of cognition are impaired in some way, if they are, after substance use has been initiated. To facilitate these goals, we have selected tasks that conform to a number of considerations and features. So first, as I already alluded to, we selected measures that were sensitive to development across 10 years of assessment. So, of course, it's not the same thing to administer a cognitive task to a 9-year-old as it is to a 19-year-old, and we wanted to select measures that could be used equivalently across that span of development. We focused on measures that are computerized, and this, of course, allows us to maximize the efficiency of administration for a large multi-site study like ABCD. We have used primarily 3 vendors for our computerized assessment: the NIH Toolbox, the Millisecond platform, and Pearson Clinical Assessments Q Interactive paradigm. So all of the measures that we utilize in the cognitive battery within ABCD fall across these 3 vendors. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We also selected measures that could be relatively easily administered, thereby minimizing not only participant burden, but research assistant burden as well. And that includes ease, not only in administering the tasks, but also being able to score them and work with the data. With longitudinal assessment, it's of course important to use measures that are repeatable and robust to retesting over multiple periods of time, and if possible, have alternate forms that can be utilized in the context of repeat assessment. So through all of these things, we hope to facilitate comparisons with other large-scale studies, and using measures such as the NIH Toolbox, which are also being used in other studies, allows us to work toward harmonization with other population neuroscience initiatives. So here what I'd like to show you is a list of our measures, but also the longitudinal assessment scheme. So the table here is kind of busy, but what you will see is that we have across the top the age of assessment for each of our waves, and then going from the study baseline all the way through year 9, you can see through the X's in various cells which measures have been administered at which ages and at which assessment points. And so, two things to draw your attention to. One is that you can tell if you just kind of scan through this table, that we have more comprehensive assessments taking place at the study baseline, year 2, year 4, year 6, and year 8. Those are the years that coincide with MRI scanning. And then in the off-scan years, which are years 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, we have a smaller number of assessments that have been administered. Overall, across the entire assessment span of ABCD, we have measures that fall roughly into 4 broad domains of assessment. So the first is measures of, you might say, general ability, perhaps aspects of intelligence. So those include measures such as picture vocabulary from the NIH Toolbox, oral reading recognition, the matrix reasoning task from Q Interactive, and other measures of visual, spatial, and arithmetic reasoning. We also have several measures of learning and memory, 2 of them through the NIH Toolbox, and 1 being the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test. There are numerous measures of executive functioning and cognitive control, although I should say some of these measures come from the fMRI task battery that is administered as part of the neuroimaging paradigm. Other measures are primarily through the NIH Toolbox. And then finally, we have worked in measures of emotion, reward processing, and risk-taking, although most of these measures, with a couple of exceptions, have been administered a little more intermittently. So that brings me to another point about the assessment scheme, which is that not every measure has been administered at every wave where it's primary. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those distinctions as this presentation progresses. You can tell, though, if you look at this table and just kind of scan through, that there are occasional measures that were omitted at certain time points and some that were added. I would like to call attention, though, to measures that are available at every assessment wave, first, as you can see on this slide, during the scan years. So we have 5 NIH Toolbox measures that have been administered at every scan year assessment. So those include picture vocabulary, oral reading recognition, picture sequence memory, the pattern comparison processing speed task, and the flanker inhibitory control task. You can see through my color coding that these 5 measures collected outside of the scanner cover the major domains of assessment that we have tried to integrate into the protocol. And then we do have 3 fMRI tasks, which I'm not going to actually say very much about in the course of this presentation, but I want you to know that they exist, that have consistently been measured across the scan years. Those are the stop signal task, the emotional end back, and the monetary incentive delay task. And then in the off-scan years, which again are years 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, we have 2 measures that have been consistently administered. The emotional Stroop task, which is a measure of cognitive control and conflict management, and the delayed discounting task, which reflects decisions that you might make where you are asked about whether you prefer an immediate lesser reward or waiting a longer period of time for a potentially greater reward. So if you're somebody who's interested in minimizing missing data across waves, the information that I've presented here and on the prior slide would provide you with some helpful guidance on measures that have been consistently measured, assessed over time. So let me say a little bit more then about protocol changes that have characterized the battery. And I'm primarily here focusing on year 6 and beyond, although there was a task introduced at year 4 that I will mention. So in some ways, the protocol changes for neurocognition, I think, could be characterized as being relatively minimal in scope. So first of all, we had 2 NIH toolbox measures, the dimensional change card sort task and the list sort working memory task, that were omitted at some of the assessment waves. So for the dimensional change card sort, we have only administered it at baseline, at year 6, and at year 8. For the list sort working memory task, we administered it at baseline, at year 4, year 6, and year 8. So at year 2, both of those measures were skipped, and at year 4, the card sort was skipped. And then the matrix reasoning task was administered at baseline and is being re-administered at year 8. So basically at years 6 and 8, we are trying to make sure that we have close to a repeat of the baseline testing battery to permit more to be done in terms of longitudinal data analysis. At year 4, we added a measure to the project, which I don't believe has been described in detail before in prior presentations. That measure is called the Behavioral Indicator of Resilience to Distress task, abbreviated BIRD, which was introduced at year 4 and is currently being repeated at year 9. The social influence task, which is a measure of sensitivity to peer influence and risk-taking based on peer influence, was administered at years 2 and 4 and then discontinued thereafter. And that is because we felt that peer influence over behavior was maximal in that period of adolescence. The little man task, which is a measure of visual spatial reasoning, was administered at baseline year 2 and year 4, and then has been paused thereafter. It's possible we will return to that measure at some later time. And finally, the game of dice task, which is a measure of risk-taking, was shortened at year 8 from its original formulation. So we still have the measure, but it's about half as long as it was previously. So I'd like to just say a little bit more about the bird task since it was introduced at year 4 and has been repeated. It's a unique measure because it measures distress tolerance, so the ability to persist in your cognitive performance despite potentially feeling distressed, or you might conversely look at this as the degree to which a person can withstand the experience of a negative emotional state. It's thought that distress tolerance develops during childhood and stabilizes thereafter, perhaps in early adolescence, but we know that having low levels of distress tolerance is associated with a number of potentially maladaptive behaviors. So, behaviors that one might engage in to attempt to avoid negative emotion. It's commonly seen in the context of conditions like depression and anxiety and disordered eating, as well as substance abuse. And high levels of distress tolerance are associated with impulsive decision making. So, let me tell you a little bit about how the bird task works. This is a measure administered through the millisecond platform. And basically, it has 3 levels of performance that youth, as they're doing the task, cycle through. And your task basically is to look at the array of numbers presented there on the right, and what you see is a dot that appears on one of the numbers. And what you have to do is try to touch the dot. And the task is speeded where it becomes increasingly difficult to achieve that objective because of how fast the task is moving along. And if you're successful, I believe it's the case that you release the little bird there from its cage. So there's a training component of the task, which calculates for an individual their average response times. Then that information is used to inform the next level where the dot is speeded, but at a level that's within reach of the participant. And then the dot starts to move faster and faster, and in fact, ultimately faster than the participant is able to reach. So the task becomes very challenging and in fact, potentially frustrating. And then at the 3rd level, the dot is moving quickly enough that it's difficult, if not impossible, for the youth to keep up. And this is where frustration is likely elicited. And importantly, the participant can quit at any time. So, what we measure, a number of things, is we measure change in affect in the course of performance. So, there are measures of positive and negative affect, pre and then post level 2. And then we also measure distress tolerance. So the extent to which one is able to persist despite potentially feeling distressed. So again, this is a task that was administered at year 4 and then is being repeated. This actually should say at year 9, which is in progress. So those are the changes really to the protocol that I'd like to emphasize. And next, what I'd like to talk a bit about are methodological considerations in using the longitudinal data. So what we would like to be able to be assured of is that the measures are psychometrically stable over time, including being reliable. We would like to know something about practice effects and their influence over performance because we are repeating the same measures a large number of times. It's important to know in assessing developmental trajectories if we see evidence of floor or ceiling effects in the data. As I'm sure many of you know, during the COVID pandemic, which coincided pretty much with assessment waves 2 and 3 of ABCD, we had to pivot to remote administration of several measures. And across sites, there have been significant numbers of youth who have continued to engage with ABCD remotely. So mode of task administration, remote versus in person, is a potential source of influence over performance. And then finally, what we'd like to know in evaluating developmental trajectories is whether we see age-related variations in performance after accounting for some of these other things, including mode of test administration, practice effects, and of course, core demographic variables. So what I'd like to share with you is a little bit of information about how we evaluate some of these parameters and some of our findings to date. So first of all, we have initiated a protocol analysis where we have begun to evaluate every task in the neurocognitive battery in terms of its sensitivity to these various factors. Now, I'm not going to go through everything that's on the table here, but I would just like to say, in terms of overall patterns, it is very common for us to observe practice effects in the data, very common for us to observe impacts of remote versus in-person administration on performance. In general, we are not seeing evidence of floor effects across most of the measures that we utilize. And really, only only the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, at least through year 4, is showing any evidence of ceiling performance, and that's in a relatively small number of participants. So overall, we feel pretty good about how this battery has performed over time. And in fact, we know that from baseline to year 4, we have been able to detect significant age-related improvements in task performance above and beyond some of these other factors. So I just want to show you a little bit about how some of this works in relation to specific tasks. And here I just want to walk you through an example of how we look for practice effects in the data. And to do this, I'm going to call your attention to the middle graph on this slide, which illustrates the NIH Toolbox flanker task. So what you can see here, actually for each of the graphs, is age is graphed along the x-axis, and along the y-axis is performance on each of these measures. And then the color coding reflects the number of administrations that the youth had experience with. So no experience is in red, having one experience with the task is in blue, 2 experiences in green, and 3 experiences in purple. The important thing here is that we have overlap in ages in relation to experience with the task. So just as an example, we have 12-year-olds who some of whom have one or two experiences with a given task. And so we can compare individuals of the same age who have different levels of experience to assess whether or not there are practice effects on performance. And then we can also look at age trajectories embedded as a function of experience with the task. So if you look at the flanker as an example, what you can see is that with each level of experience with the task, so having 1, 2, and 3 levels of prior experience, so times that you've done the task, that there are significant gains in performance with practice. And you can see if you look at the blue lines and the green lines, in particular, how it is that individuals of the same age with more experience, so the ones with more experience are in green, are performing better. But yet, even with significant performance gains with practice, we are still able to detect positive improvements in performance with age. And the same thing is true for the NIH Toolbox Picture Vocabulary Test, which is graphed there on the left-hand side, and with the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test 30-minute delayed recall. And the Ray is kind of a unique measure because here we did have an alternate form that we used at wave 2. And so what you can see is that individuals, a number of them who had one prior experience with the task, so those are kids who came in at baseline and then again at year 2, that their performance actually got a little bit worse over time or across age. And that's because inadvertently that alternate form is proving to look a little more difficult than the original task form. So that was unintended, but yet we nonetheless can see significant improvement in age, even considering the impact of practice, the negative impact of practice in this case, and what happens over time. And by the way, at the next assessment wave, when the Ray was used, we went back to the original task form. We have also been able to look at the impact of remote versus in-person testing on performance. And I will tell you that the general finding there is that there is slightly worse, but significantly worse performance with remote assessment, pretty much regardless of what the measure is that we examine. Here, for the NIH Toolbox Oral Reading Total Score, um, you actually can't see it incredibly well on the graph, but performance is measurably worse with remote assessment. The findings are even stronger for tasks that have reaction time components. So one example of a task like that is the Stroop task. So our caution is that we really highly recommend that researchers control for visit type when they are conducting statistical analyses, in particular, looking at trajectories over time and looking at age-related differences in performance, because youth may have had different types of experience with the same task over the course of time. I'd like to next share with you a little bit of information about how we can examine components of interest that are embedded in the longitudinal battery over the course of longitudinal assessment when we've made changes to the protocol. So, of course, it's kind of a problem if you're trying to analyze the longitudinal data and what you realize is that measures that you have an interest in were not necessarily administered at every assessment wave. So, what we did, a number of us, is we conducted a principal components analysis of the ABCD baseline battery. This is a paper that was published in 2019 in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience. And basically what we found evidence for were 3 broad components of performance, which we labeled general ability, executive function, and learning and memory. And you can see here which measures loaded most strongly onto each component. So just as an example, for general ability, the strongest loadings were for picture vocabulary, oral reading, and the little man task of visual spatial reasoning. For executive function, the 3 executive function measures from the NIH toolbox, the flanker, dimensional change card sort, and pattern comparison processing speed loaded most strongly. And then for learning and memory, we had 2 NIH toolbox measures and the Ray auditory verbal learning test. If you have an interest in digging into this a little bit more, here is the reference for the paper, and then you can see in the table here the specific nature of the task loadings, which I'm not going to say more about, but just to have you keep in mind those 3 overall factors. So an issue, as I mentioned, is that across waves, we didn't administer all of the same tasks. So for example, at wave 2, we only had 7 of those 9 measures that we analyzed at baseline. So what we've recently done is to undertake another principal components analysis where we take the wave 2 data. So this is based again on 7 tasks rather than 9, and we conducted the same Bayesian principal components analysis. And what we found was evidence for the same 3 components that we observed in the baseline data. So general ability, executive function, and learning and memory with similar loadings and similar tasks loading heavily onto those components. What we then did was to go back to the baseline data, and we created both solutions within the baseline data set. So we had our original 9-task principal components analysis and our reduced 7-task principal components analysis. And what we did was then to correlate the component scores across those 2 solutions. And as you can see, if you look at the diagonals in this table, the correlations are quite high between the original 9 subtest battery and the reduced 7 subtest battery, again, focusing on the baseline data, which allows us to evaluate both solutions within the same data set. However, the situation gets even more restricted, as I described to you, when we go to year 4, because at year 4, we only have 5 of those original 9 subtests in common to the full battery. And those 5 subtasks are all from the NIH toolbox: picture vocabulary, the flanker, pattern comparison processing speed, picture sequence memory, and oral reading. So when we conduct the principal components analysis on this 5 subtest battery using baseline year 2 and year 4 data, we find evidence yet again for 3 components. The task loadings are a little bit different here because it's a reduced set of tasks. The first component really is probably best construed as a crystallized cognition component. It's most strongly carried by picture vocabulary and oral reading. The second component is carried by the flanker and pattern comparison processing speed task, so it still seems to reflect executive function. And then the third component, measuring learning and memory, a potential weakness is it's carried by 1 task, the picture sequence memory task, but yet that loading is quite high. When we take this reduced battery and once again apply it to the baseline data set, we once again observe pretty high correlations between the principal components derived from this 5 subtest battery as compared to the 9 original tasks. And so this allowed us to conclude with some confidence that, at least based on this principal component method, which is not the only method one might use to reduce the data, that we are picking up on the same constructs over time even in the course of having a reduced assessment battery longitudinally. And we do have some evidence to suggest that this reduced 5 subtest component structure, that the component scores are comparably correlated with child behavior checklist metrics as we observed at baseline when we derived components based on a larger subset of tasks. So, in summary, what I'd like to emphasize once again is that with the neurocognitive battery, we've designed the battery to be sensitive to changes in typical development that occur over the course of adolescence, to be sensitive to altered trajectories due to various factors, both environmental and genetic. The tasks that we have administered cover broad domains of function that are of interest to the scientific community, including general ability, learning and memory, executive functioning, and various aspects of emotion, reward sensitivity, and risk-taking. Those first 3 domains are strongly supported by the principal components analysis that we've conducted based on relevant measures. And related to that, a core set of measures administered longitudinally appears to capture the originally intended domains of assessment. We have had some changes in protocol over time, some measures not being administered at every assessment wave, but at years 6 and 8, which year 6 recently concluded, but year 8 is still in progress, we have repeated several measures that were administered more intermittently. So for those of you who are able to wait for year 6 and year 8 data to be released, you will have a battery that's very similar to the baseline assessment to examine. Longitudinal analyses that we've conducted to date, focusing on baseline through year 4, indicate that the core measures are stable, that effects of age, notably improvements in performance with age, can be discerned above and beyond the effects of practice. But we do recommend that anyone analyzing the data should account for mode of administration, remote versus in-person, when they are looking at the neurocognitive data. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I just want you to know that I and members of my work group are available if any of you should have questions about the neurocognitive battery. So here I'd like to once again acknowledge my work group co-chair, Jim Bjork from Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as our full work group members, consulting members, and several trainee members. Thank you again for listening.